teacher value added?
I mean, I think a really good starting place would be to wade into some of the materials that talk about this in a little bit more depth. So, you know, our newspaper articles are a good starting point, but there's a lot of kind of policy papers for non-PhDs that help explain the mechanism. I think a lot of our critics don't really understand how value-added works. And when you do, I think a lot of teachers would feel far better about being judged by this measure as one component of their evaluation than by the current system, because, you know, teachers have been complaining for years that their current evaluations are totally arbitrary and subjective, and they're right. Essentially, if the principal doesn't like you, you very well may get a bad evaluation, and there's nothing you can point to countermand that. So it is narrow and imperfect and shouldn't be used alone, but it's powerful because it's objective, and it really does tell you something about what's going on. So the first thing is understanding a little bit about just the methodology itself. I think that's really important, and that it's less scary when you start to understand it a little bit more, and there's actually benefits that become obvious that you're saying, well, that makes sense. The other thing I think that you all will be stepping into is has kind of emerged alongside of this debate, which is a whole discussion about transparency in public schools. And I think one of the things that this story contributed to that was already around that is building momentum is a desire for people outside of the school system to have a better idea of what's going on. And I suspect that we'll see more of that, not less of that in the future. And so, you know, teachers, for better or for worse, have often in the past worked in isolation. They go into their classroom every day, they shut the door, and they teach. And they may or may not know what's going on next door or across the hall. That's changing, and teachers are being asked to be more transparent. And a lot of teachers welcome that, and a lot of teachers want more of that. So our hope was that in providing some of this information about performance to parents would be one vehicle by which parents could get more involved in their public schools, whether it be by advocating for their kid to get into the classrooms of the effective teachers, or by raising concerns about the presence of ineffective teachers and what impact those are having on the kids. I think that's going to continue to move in that direction. There's other ways in which transparency is growing, but that means that teaching is going to be a different profession than it used to be, and it's going to be a much more scrutinized profession than it used to be. And for who are kind of focused on improving, that may be a welcoming thing. And for people who don't want that kind of scrutiny, it may be frightening.
I'm going to ask a couple of other questions, but I'd appreciate if you all now, if you have questions, please type them in, and I'll try to pick some out and ask Jason to answer them for you. What do you make of a lot of the criticism of the report is that you're trying to scapegoat teachers. This is just another example of teacher bashing. How do you respond to that kind of argument?
Yeah. In many ways, I understand where the sentiment comes from. Teachers are kind of our frontline workers in public education, and anytime there's a debate about whether public education is working or not, they feel attacked and blamed for the failures of what everybody knows is a very complicated system, teaching kids that are often challenging and have huge challenges outside of school that these teachers feel held responsible for. So I completely get that. I think there's also they're feeling the weight of the conclusions from your research and that of others that have really guided us from focusing on things like class size and the economics of education and some of these kind of outside of school issues to really the role that individual teachers play. And when the weight of the research is pointing us towards individual teacher performance, you know, everyone's going to be looking at how individual teachers perform. And so teachers have, in a sense, gone from a system where for decades there's been zero accountability, and now they're really feeling the heat. They're really feeling the full weight of attempts to do accountability, and they're in this experimental phase where we're trying to figure out how to do accountability right. So they're feeling the weight of that on their shoulders, and they're feeling oftentimes blamed for the failings of public education in general, despite all the things that they see going on every day.
Right. I mean, it's certainly a time of change, and you know, this new era of accountability is challenging for individual teachers. It's challenging for schools of education. as we try to figure out how to help aspiring teachers get the skills that they need, to function in this environment. Here's a great question from Carla. She says, if experience and educational background are not good indicators of effective teaching, then what are some?
It's a great question. We're laughing because the answer is both funny and sad. In short, there are none. There's obviously caveats to that, but a lot of the things that we measure about teachers, when you try to correlate them with value-added scores or with other scores of teacher outcomes, basically none of them prove very predictive. And that's a major problem. I mean, particularly for education schools, if you're trying to create effective teachers and we don't know what makes teachers effective, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
So I'm simplifying a little bit. There are certain things that I think we would all agree on highly effective teachers do well. What is less clear is how to help less effective teachers get better, and kind of, are those characteristics that we're not identifying that are making teachers effective, can we replicate them in some way?
Right. I mean, this is really an absolutely critical question, because most of the policies and the structures that we use in public education don't do anything other than reward these indicators that aren't correlated with effective teaching. So salaries for teachers are typically based on years of experience and credentials. Whether you can get laid off is typically related to how many years of experience you have in the school district. Getting lifetime employment and tenure, which in California is after 2 years probationary period, is based on an evaluation tool that is these drive-by, 12 minutes of a principal dropping in on you once a year. So if we know that these are very, very poorly related to at least one measure of student learning, we've got a real challenge. But I thought one of the fascinating things about some of the teachers you talked to was the uncertainty about whether we could transfer some of the things that you saw about effective teachers to other teachers, and that would be through professional development, through the kinds of programs that we run here at Rossier. A lot of skepticism that was even possible.
It was interesting to me. I mean, we wrote a story about the 100 most effective teachers in our analysis, and one of the things we did is we interviewed as many of them as we could, and we said, why are you so effective? What are you doing? And what do you think, and what advice do you have for your colleagues? More than one of them said, you can't bottle it, and I am effective because I am effective, and I just was born that way, and if they're not effective, they should get out, but there's nothing I can do to help them be more effective. Essentially, you either are a teacher or you're not a teacher, and the sooner you figure that out and make a decision based on it, the better. That's a little frightening.
Yeah, wow. I don't think those of us at Rossier would believe that teachers are born. They're certainly made, but clearly, to figure out what does work requires the kinds of data that you've just begun to produce. I mean, without those measures and without other measures as well, observations and principal feedback and so on, we're never going to be able to identify what the ingredients are. We, as a country, we spend billions of dollars on professional development for teachers. Teachers, individuals, spend millions of dollars of their own money getting credentials, getting certified, and if none of that is contributing to student learning, we're wasting a lot of resources, as well as hurting kids. Here's a couple of questions that they're related, so I'll bundle them together, which is the issue of how value-added takes account of different kinds of students and different contexts. So why is it not unfair to kids in a particularly poor school or with special ed kids or whatever?
Right. So this is really important, and this is part of what I was saying about understand the methodology. A lot of the common reaction we've had from teachers is, don't hold me accountable for my test scores because I've got all kids who are limited English. And how can you compare me to a teacher who has kids who aren't limited English? Or, my neighbor down the hall has all gifted kids, and, how can you compare us? And I think it's an obvious and an important question. It points, I think, to the strength of value-added, which is that that's true with achievement thing, and we're used to a system that goes on achievement. So yes, gifted kids are much higher achievers than kids who are 5 years behind grade level or limited English and still just catching up with the basics. And if you only looked at their achievement levels, then you would reward the teachers who teach, the brighter kids who came from wealthier communities. What value added tries to do is the opposite. It tries to take into account the prior performance of students and where they are, and use that as the baseline for what we expect of them and what we hold teachers accountable for. So, for example, a teacher who teaches limited English students, within the model of value added, there should be a variable that says limited English students and factors that in and controls for that fact. And also, you're at the very least looking at those own students' prior test scores. And by looking at their prior test scores, the notion of the statistics is you're kind of enveloping in all the kind of baggage that came with that child's context and taking that into account and saying, well, we know that you got an F in algebra last year, and we're taking that into account, and we're not going to expecting you to get an A. We're expecting you to get a D.
Right.
And if you get a D, then your teacher is a good teacher.
Right. So value added tries to look at how people have done relative to what they would have been expected to do. So in many ways, it should be fairer than the levels of achievement that we often look at in kind of the first generation of accountability systems.
Does it work? Is it good at doing that? That's the subject of a lot of debate.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not perfect, but I think one of the most interesting things about your series of stories is the finding that often schools and teachers who are perceived to be doing really great things, in fact, are not getting much extra learning out of those children. And so what you're learning is that they're not challenging those kids.
Right.
And you're being, and similarly, you're making unfair inferences under the old system about teachers who are in fact doing incredible things with students, albeit them starting at low levels of achievement and their levels of achievement still being low after a year, but the growth is really remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. What you see a lot, and people who've been in classrooms know this, is teachers who are, give their kids high grades and are great communicators with the parents and are perceived as great teachers, but who may not actually be very effective instructors. I mean, being well-liked is not always a measure of how good you are at your job. And because we're not looking at data oftentimes, we're mixing those things up.
I mean, these questions do get at a very big challenge of value added, which is that traditionally the value added measures have relied on standardized test scores, and not all grades and all subjects are tested, and in some environments a student may have many different teachers. And so one of the students is asking about kindergarten. Typically we don't have measures in kindergarten. Typically we don't have measures outside of core subjects. And so one of the challenges of value added is if you're going to apply some measure similar to value added in teacher evaluation, is it fair to do it just for some teachers and not others? And if you're going to do it for all teachers, how can you construct value added like measures for the PE teacher or for the special ed teacher or whatever?
Right, right. So yeah, under the current system, only about 30 or 40% of teachers in a school district will have value added type data for them. So it's limited, and the question is, what do you do about the rest? If you're grading some teachers just by the nature of what they teach and holding them very accountable. And districts have handled this in different ways. Some school districts, like Washington, D.C., developed this kind of robust component, and in places where value added wasn't available, they would increase the weight that sophisticated observations had, and they would assign a school level value added and impute that to teachers and say, well, we're going to give everyone in the school some credit for the school's value added because we don't have an individual score for you.